My very special guest today is Timothy Ash. Tim is an economist by education and experience. He focuses on the international economy and specifically over the last several years on the results and the effects of the sanctions on the Russian economy and the fallout from that. Over the last few years, he's also been laser focused, of course, on the tragedy that is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Tim's articles and pieces can be seen all over the internet. He writes a lot specifically for Kiev Post, but as well as many other publications. He's been on the No Delusion Zone several times before, and I'm very happy to have him back. So, Tim, welcome to the No Delusion Zone.
Yeah, my pleasure.
As I said, you've been here before. We've touched on a lot of these issues before. Again, as I said in the intro, focusing primarily on Russia, the sanctions, the invasion, and so forth. But and as I said just before we went live, I am more disgusted than usual, and that's saying a lot because I'm pretty disgusted with the so-called diplomacy between the American administration and Ukraine and NATO and Russia. Uh, what happened before, during, and after the Alaska summit is just, it's appalling. It's a travesty. We still don't know the fallout yet. We still don't know if secret deals were actually made yet that we don't know about. What we do know is that it was a complete embarrassment to the Americans, to the Ukrainians. It was a disgrace rolling out the red carpet to Putin, having him on an American military base when he is an indicted war criminal, international felon, war criminal. I've never seen anything like it in my life. I hope I never see anything like it again. But that's where we are. Let me start out. As I said in the intro, you are an economist and you do speak and write a lot about the sanctions. Let me just ask you. I, of course, have my own opinion, but are the sanctions doing a damn bit of good to the Russian economy right now? I mean, I read a lot about how they're on their last legs, and the people are ready to rise up. I've been reading about that for several years. So, what's the state of the sanctions and the effect on the Russian economy as
Hmm.
of now?
Yeah, look, I mean, problems with sanctions regimes or sanctions on on bad regimes uh, are that these countries don't stand still, right? I mean, they take active measures to get around sanctions. You can think of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. You think of Cuban administration, Venezuela. I mean, countries, find ways to get around sanctions, right? And it's a cat and mouse game. I mean, I always kind of like to go back, way back, and argue the durability of the Russian economy reflects two things, or maybe three things, really. But firstly, the one person who knew the invasion was going to happen was Putin. He planned for it. He built up Russian defenses, buffers. They had 600 and odd billion of foreign exchange reserves at the outset of the full-scale invasion, and they deleveraged, and I saw that happening since the first imposition of sanctions in April 2014, just after the annexation of Crimea. You saw in the period from then to 2022 and the full-scale invasion a sea change in Russian macro policy. Right, actually, Russia ran very conservative fiscal and monetary policy that belied actually its balance sheet and its ratios, right? I mean, and it was all in my mind about building defenses for Putin's assumption that he was going to go to war with Ukraine or with the West at some point in the future, right? So he knew it was going to happen. He built up Russia's defenses. That gave lots of durability. And then the other angle is, unfortunately, we've not been really very clever in terms of sanctions, right? We've been too pedestrian. We've signaled what we're going to do way ahead of time, giving Russia lots of time to figure out ways to circumvent sanctions. But ultimately, the sanctions we've imposed have just not been tough enough. We could have done a lot more. Why is that? I mean, it's because ultimately we've not been willing to pay the price of sanctions. Sanctions are not cost-free, right? They hurt the target, Russia in this case, but they also hurt ourselves, right? I mean, they restrict trade, they can have impact on global markets, all those kind of things, right? And we've been very reluctant to bear any cost ourselves, right? Any risk that somehow there could be a backdraft. And that's meant we've always done less. We've taken lots more time to think about them, lots of time to think about who it's going to hurt, and then backroom negotiations between different countries about, who's going to get hurt more and all this kind of stuff. And so in the end, we've just not done enough. And then the third point is, what we have done, we've not policed it very effectively, right? Secondary sanctions, imposing costs on countries and individuals and companies that help Russia get around sanctioned, have been very weak, right? I mean, if I think of the UK, we have identified individuals that have helped Russia get around sanctions, but no one's been penalized, no one's gone to jail. There's no price, there's no cost for breaking sanctions. Actually, there's a lot of money to be made by brokering sanctions busting deals. So it's been a green light to many countries and companies to do that, right? So it's on us, really. I mean, we've, and again, the basic point I'd make, and if I think of, we can look at the West in general, but Europe in particular, our politicians, our leaders talk about the threat from Russia. They're very quick to get on a train to Kiev and have a photo opportunity with President Zelensky. But actually, if they really recognise that the threat from Russia was existential to us, to our system of government, right, they would have been willing to take some of the cost of imposing sanctions to hurt Russia, right? So, and they haven't, right, which suggests to me that actually they still don't actually consider Russia to be this existential threat, right? Or they're a bit blasé and they assume the Ukrainians ultimately are the front line and they're going to stop Russia, and it means they have to do less, right? But unless you're willing to pay a price through sanctions, through limiting the ability of the Russian economy to regenerate military capability to be used in Ukraine, and then ultimately potentially against us, I don't think you're serious, right? So that's been the reality, unfortunately.
Well, I want to stay on sanctions. I happen to think that sanctions were and still could be the key, but as you said, they haven't been applied correctly or enough. I'm going to circle back to the enforcement of sanctions in just a moment. But I want to ask you, Tim, in your opinion, what have been the most successful sanctions so far, and what have been the least?
Well, actually, people often ask, what have sanctions achieved? Actually, I go right back to the beginning, and the first imposition of sanctions, as I mentioned, which was after the annexation of Crimea. No one expected the Obama administration to roll out sanctions at that point in time. Now, they arguably weren't very aggressive, but if you remember, there was the period between the annexation of Crimea and then the very significant military intervention in Donbass by Russian forces later that summer, right? And actually, if you go back then, there was a period, 2 or 3 months, when the Ukrainians were pretty defenseless, right? I mean, you can see how they annexed Crimea, or they took Crimea in a matter of hours. In reality, Ukraine really had very little military capability. In Donbass itself, again, the Ukrainians were in a very weak position. If Russia at that point in time had gone in full scale with a much greater intervention, I think the Russians would have actually taken much more territory and would have been in a prime position to do what they failed to do after the full-scale invasion in 22. What was interesting is, after the annexation of Crimea, the first imposition of sanctions by the Obama administration, what you saw is the Russians were shocked, were surprised. They waited. There was, if you remember that point in time, there was a very substantial impact on Russian markets, right? The ruble got hit really badly. People were questioning what's next. How is this going to impact on Russia? And it took a matter of weeks or perhaps a month or so for the Russians to figure out ways to get around it. But that month was really critical in enabling the Ukrainians to get their defences in order, because basically, I think no one at that time, or very few people, had expected the annexation, the intervention annexation of Crimea, and then ultimately the first intervention in Donbass later that summer. But those few weeks were really critical in helping the Ukrainians build defences that eventually, they were able to stop a larger scale incursion in 2014. So they have been successful. I'd say the second one, if I think of there's a lot of debate about frozen Russian assets or immobilized Russian assets, and we haven't done enough. I should, though, give due credit to, I think, the US, the Biden administration in the first few weeks after the full-scale invasion. The actual move to immobilize 300 odd billion of CBR assets was a genius move, actually, and it happened, I remember, in a matter of days. I remember being phoned by someone in Washington and asking what I thought. This was like on a Tuesday, and asking me what I thought about the idea. And I think by the Saturday it had been done. And with hindsight, it caught the Russians totally off guard. If they'd have been given a bigger heads up, they would have actually moved the assets. And they weren't able to do that, right? Because it happened so quickly. Now, again, we can debate now moving from immobilization to seizing, but the fact that they were immobilized has given us some leverage, right? I mean, we have these assets now in our jurisdiction. The Russians can't access them. We have the option of moving to seize them. We can, I would argue we should seize them. We could allocate them to Ukraine's defense and its reconstruction recovery. We could use them to support our own defense ultimately. But it was the initial move to immobilize that has given us those options, right? And if we hadn't, the Russians would have taken the money back and we'd have lost that. So, I mean, that was a very effective move in the first instance. And, we've now subsequently thought of different means to allow Russia some access to those funds, obviously the interest stream, etc. There's this ERA mechanism that's been adopted that's given about, I think, $50 billion in effect of financing from the CBR assets. We can do lots more, definitely.
The thing of it is, though, Tim, we haven't. And I guess that's what
we haven't. Yeah, sure.
Makes me angry, makes me and millions of other people angry, including all of the Ukrainians. That was 3.5 years ago. And look what's happened in the 3.5 years in terms of the devastation and tragedy and horror that's been going on in Ukraine, and that 300 plus some billion dollars in frozen assets. It's been, batted around whether that should be used eventually for reconstruction, whether we should give it to them now. If you took all of that money, just call it $300 billion. Give it to Ukraine. Well, guess what? They could use that to buy the weapons that they need from America, which would make Trump giddy, that he'd get all this money, and it would finance the defense of Ukraine and probably, in my opinion, the victory of Ukraine. That's a lot of money, even today. Air defense, fighters, missiles, drones, you name it. It really upsets me a lot. I just had to get that out there. In your opinion, why?
No, I mean,
why haven't they released this money? They seized it. That's great. Kumbaya. I'm all for it. It's 3.5 years. Why haven't they released it to somebody, preferably the Ukrainians? But why aren't we using it in the defense of Ukraine?
Well, we need to be correct in terms of terminology. It's been immobilized. We haven't seized it.
No,
right?
That's what my question is. Why haven't we seized it?
The genius move was immobilization, right?
Agreed.
And it was done very quickly.
Yes.
As I said, people like myself were arguing 3 years ago that it needed to be seized and allocated to Ukraine. I mean, just imagine if the money had been given, Ukraine, as you mentioned, would have been able 3 years ago to buy Patriots, F-16s, HIMARS, ATACMS, all those.
The war would be over. Every military expert I talked to said the war would be over. Ukraine would have won. Russia would have had to retreat.
Absolutely. And the other angle I put is, in a way, the fact that we didn't use it meant that, we had to fund Ukraine from Western taxpayers' money, in effect, right? Now, that's been a present to populist nationalists like Donald Trump. I mean, Donald Trump goes around saying that the US has spent 300 odd billion funding Ukraine. I mean, that's not the case. That's not the reality. The actual number is about 128 billion, and Europe has spent a lot more in supporting Ukraine. But actually, if we'd have used the 300 billion straight away, the US wouldn't have spent any. There wouldn't be this gift to the far right to argue that our taxpayer money, US taxpayer money, has been used to fund Ukraine.
No,
Actually,
this uncommon
Russian
genius, the smartest person in the room, could have pressured the Europeans, specifically the Belgians, who I understand hold the lion's share of this 300 billion, as well as whatever is in American banks. He could have, because look at everybody else he's pressured. They've bended knee. He could have pressured them to release, to seize, to use the proper terminology, to seize all of these funds and buy American weapons and ammunition. It would be a win-win for Trump. I'm still mystified that he hasn't done that, except that I don't think he quite connects the dots.
Yeah, look, I mean, why hasn't it happened? It hasn't happened because there's this blob. I describe it. I mean, it's quite interesting that, I mean, I've been involved in a campaign, a lobbying campaign to try and get this done. And when you have conversations with politicians, normal members of parliament or Senate or Congress, whatever it is, and you explain the logic behind it, I've done this in Germany, in the UK, in the US, etc. There's 100% positive reaction, right? The argument. This is a genius idea, right? Let's just do it. And then what tends to happen? The politicians go away and they consult with treasuries and central banks, who find lots of excuses not to do it, right? I mean, that's the reality, and it's their job. It's like the computer says no. I mean, they find, and I would argue that, look, in the end, the arguments used against it are legal arguments, rule of law based arguments, concerns about if we do it, impact on reserve currency status for the dollar and the euro, risk of retaliation by Russia. All those arguments are that there are counter arguments, right? There is a legal basis for seizing them. It's called countermeasures. It basically implies that sovereign immunity only applies for countries that are abiding by international law. Russia is not abiding by international law. So essentially, while a country like Russia is not abiding by international law, you can have a timeout on the sovereign immunity, and you can take countermeasures against that country to encourage it to change its behavior, right? This is a classic case of that. I think the legal argument is pretty clear. And even if it wasn't, in the end, laws are made by politicians, right? So if this issue is important enough, then laws can be changed to make it happen. And I would argue the defense of Ukraine is a national security priority, certainly for Europe, than it was for the US, certainly under Biden. Then laws could have been changed to have made it happen. The reserve currency argument is a weak one because I would argue the move to a mobilization was almost, it's already been, the money's already been put beyond the reach of Russia. If you're a China or a Saudi Arabia or a Gulf country that maybe is worried about something similar happening to you, you've already had the message that your assets are vulnerable, and you would have presumably already moved them. There's been no evidence of a movement of reserve of assets away from reserve currencies. And the reason it hasn't happened particularly is there are no alternative markets for China or Saudi Arabia or Gulf states to put their FX reserves, right? So there's no alternative. It hasn't happened already. And then the other argument is retaliation. So the concern that if we do this, Russia will retaliate against Western assets in the Russian jurisdiction. Putin's already done that and is doing it, right? And the other argument is, well, if you pull punches in terms of seizing these assets, actually you're rewarding companies that made bad investment decisions by investing in Russia in the first place. Effectively, what you're doing is you're using Western taxpayers' money to fund Ukraine because you don't want to use immobilized Russian assets, because you don't want to help bail out Western companies that basically didn't read the tea leaves, well, actually didn't read the clear messaging from our own governments that Russia is a malign actor. You could go back to a decade to the annexation of Crimea when the messaging was pretty clear. They made bad investment calls, so why should we be putting our taxpayer money on the line to save their skins and their wallets, in effect? So there's lots of different reasons. I mean, but there's been a huge lobbying effort by Russia to stop this happening. And some of those vested interests, particularly in Western big business, who, again, don't want their assets seized in Russia itself, right? So that's why it hasn't happened. But in the end, if we think the victory of Ukraine is a national security priority, certainly for Europe, then we just need to make this happen. We just need to get it done, right? And it's kind of interesting how a number of significant Western politicians, when they've left office, have suddenly been very supportive of it. I think of Rishi Sunak, former Prime Minister of the UK, Boris Johnson. They've written opinion pieces in support of it. Why didn't they do it when they were in office? Right? They had the opportunity. They didn't move. But anyway, look, there's been a lot of work being conducted on this issue. I've been part of, again, various working groups on it. It can easily be done. And interestingly, in the last few days, we've seen that the European Commission may finally be beginning to move a little bit in terms of their suggestions that I mentioned the existing decision that was taken to use some of the interest earned on immobilized Russian assets. There's an interesting idea at the moment that, again, it's something I recommended 3 years ago, but anyway, it's finally been acted upon, in that they are thinking about moving the assets to a more actively managed vehicle that can earn much higher returns. So if you think about it, foreign exchange reserves, like Russia's central bank reserves, are normally invested in risk-free assets, US treasuries, bonds, gilts, which yield earn a relatively low yield. I suggested 3.5 years ago, or 3 years odd ago, that it could be more actively managed. You could invest in a portfolio of emerging market assets. It could earn 8 to 10% a year. So instead of only earning something like 10 billion or 12 billion a year, you could potentially earn $30 billion a year plus, and that could be given to Ukraine. It would cover Ukraine's annual budget financing needs in warfare. So it could be a significant amount of money. Another idea, again, one of mine, is that and a way to get around the rule of law issue is the money could be used to buy debt issued by Ukraine to fund its defense and its reconstruction. Russia would still own the underlying asset. Its property rights wouldn't be at risk, but you would give access to Ukraine to the full 330 billion of central bank assets without having to seize the assets, in effect. Now, ultimately, if that happens, the Ukraine would have a liability to Russia, but whether or not it repaid that debt would depend on negotiations around peace and reparations. Now, if you think about it, there's probably around $1 trillion worth of damage done by Russia to Ukraine. Ukraine could offset the 330 billion in debt to Russia against that $1 trillion liability from Russia to pay reparations. So look, in the end, on the immobilized Russian asset issue, there are solutions. It's not complicated stuff, but it requires leadership. It requires political leadership at the highest level in Europe and in the US. And I am surprised, actually, that the Trump administration has not seen this golden goose of the immobilized Russian assets. I mean, I assume there has been some support in the US Congress for going after these immobilized Russian assets, but Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, this week seemed to pour cold water on that, suggest that this money will be somehow used in negotiations with Russia in the future. I struggle with that. I mean, I don't think Putin will stop his desire to invade Ukraine or continue to invade and capture Ukraine on whether or not he gets $300 billion of CBR money back. It's not even in his decision set, to be honest.
Well, Tim,
He doesn't like it.
I've read pretty much all of the rule of law arguments that you've talked about. There are no secrets, and all I can do is to use a British common law term, bullocks. And we would say here bullshit, and I could go on. It's nonsense to a person like myself sitting here, and you're absolutely right. I mean, I've heard all these arguments, and I know what the European politicians are saying. And to a person like me, and I know to all the Ukrainians, this is absolutely unbelievable that they would be debating these finer points of international law and diplomacy when talking about the Russian government, the invasion, the complete rape of Ukraine in violation of everything that's decent and holy and legal. And they're trying to splice and dice the niceties of international law, whether they should seize these immobilized assets, and if so, how can they do it? And maybe we should just use the interest. I'm enraged. I mean, I'm just enraged. We're way past that. We should be way past that. Besides bullocks, there's another word. It's called cowardice. And I've used it a lot in my articles and podcasts. What you're talking about, and you've said it, is a lack of leadership. All of this comes down to a lack of leadership. If the leaders of Europe, just a few of them, had banded together, specifically, of course, the UK, France, Germany, and gotten together and said, no, this is what we're going to do. This is an existential danger to Europe, to our country. If you other, NATO and EU members don't want to stand up for yourself, well, that's your problem. We're going to get behind whatever has to be done to seize this money and then work out a mechanism to give it to Ukraine to either pay America for these weapons or divvy it up between NATO, Europe, and America, but basically fund the defense and the victory over Russia, and if there's anything left, to the reconstruction of Ukraine. To me, this is just common sense, and everything you've said is true, and I've read it before, and you're very calm about it because you're a Brit, and that's what you guys do, and that's why it's great. I'm very passionate about this, and you look at it logically, which you should. I just get enraged. That's why I could never be a diplomat. I was better being a soldier or a cop, because this type of insanity during a war just doesn't wash with me. I don't want to stick on that, though, because you were very eloquent in why this hasn't been done. I'm going to circle back to what I said at the beginning of the talk about sanctions, and it comes back to leadership and cowardice again. But I'll ask you, you mentioned some of the oligarchs and billionaires that are living in the UK, for example, that are still flaunting the sanctions. Why in God's name? What's the upside? I'll ask you this. What's the upside to Starmer or any of the British government to not punishing these oligarchs that are under sanction, or just enforcing the sanctions within their own jurisdiction more harshly than they are? I don't get it.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, we have moved against many of those oligarchs
Yes.
in the UK. Many of them have left now. A lot of the assets have been immobilized in the UK. Unfortunately, not very much has been done with the money. Same kind of problem. So again, it's glacial. And it's we found lots of reasons.
What are they afraid of? Do they think that Medvedev is going to convince Putin to launch a nuke at London? I mean, what are they afraid of at this point?
Yeah, look, I mean, it all boils down to this idea of risk perceptions, right? I mean, if you think this, and it's not just, for me, it's not just the military balance or the military risk. It's and I think many of our politicians find it very easy to spend their own taxpayer money. It's like free money. So like supporting Ukraine is 100 billion a year, right? And they much prefer to charge us to support Ukraine than to charge the Russian taxpayer, right? I mean, again, it makes no sense in my mind that, again, we have $330 billion of
That's
Russian
insane.
taxpayer money
That's
sitting,
insane.
sitting in Western bank accounts doing
Mhm.
nothing.
Yes.
And rather than going after that, it's the easier option for the UK government or the French government or the American government is to charge you and me and take our taxpayer money to support Ukraine and our own defense. I mean, supporting Ukraine is in our interest, but we should be cleverer, and we should be using Russian taxpayer money to fund it. And if
Well,
we did, if we'd have done
I
that,
I have to jump in, Tim. I'm sorry because this really pisses me off. I don't know how much you communicate with people in Russia right now. I do a lot. Um, And I can't tell you how infuriating it is for me to receive videos. They use their VPNs to send me videos of them and their families or other people going to these fairs, to these conferences, to these festivals, to concerts, to food cafes and restaurants, and just having a hell of a time. Now, granted, that's not all of Russia. It's just Moscow. And as a Russian will tell you, Moscow is not Russia. I don't care. The fact is, they don't even know there's a war. They don't, if they do, they don't care. So this is not hurting the middle to upper class Russians at all. And I'm just following up on what you're saying. Why should we, force the Russians to pay for this? Let's have in your case, the taxpayers of the UK pay for it. That is just insane.
yeah, and I would agree. And we just, I think, lack like a holistic view of the risks, right? So just let's imagine what the scenario is if Russia is not stopped, Putin is not stopped. What are the consequences of that, right? Consequences are he wins a victory in Ukraine. So Russia's borders to NATO expand westwards, would be a threat to the Baltic states, to Poland for further Russian expansion west. Russia would capture, the two biggest military industrial complexes in Europe now are Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine has a huge military industrial complex now. So if Russia was able to add Ukraine's to it, it would outgun Europe massively. But meanwhile, Russia continues to be a malign actor against to destabilize and intervene in Western politics, right? I mean, Russia's intervention in Syria, I think back in 2015, what was that about? I mean, that was about creating instability in Syria and the Middle East to force migrants through Turkey into Europe to fan, fan support for the far right in Europe around concerns about migration and immigration, right? I mean, that's why he went into Syria. Putin has been, again, supporting far right parties in Europe, to destabilize our politics, and it's working, right? I mean, unfortunately, it's working. We're just not very clever. We work on a glacial pace. We try and abide by all the rules, and where Putin thinks outside the box, right? So we just need to be a lot cleverer.
I could go on with that about playing by the rules and at a glacial pace. Um, you wrote an article, I think your most recent article, correct me if I'm wrong, in the Kiev Post about the infamous Land for Peace deal. Why? And one of the questions you ask is what a lot of us are asking every single day. Doesn't Trump get it, or why doesn't he get it? Why is he still trying to negotiate with Putin and think that he's an equal, honest broker, an honest actor in all of this? I'll tell you right now, I've changed my opinion on this, and that is whether or not Trump is an asset of Russia. I initially said no, I don't think so. It doesn't really matter because of his actions, but he's gone so far past that now that if without having supporting evidence, I happen to believe that he is only because of the recent actions that he's taking, not his his words and his actions, blackmail if nothing else, which is how they become an asset in the first place. Why is that? Well, let's assume that you believe he's not an asset. Just looking at it from a diplomatic or economic standpoint, why are they being so stupid? I'm talking about the Trump administration, all of them. Trump, Marco Rubio, Witkoff, all of them.
Yeah, well, look, people like yourself and myself who've been following Russia for a long time. I mean, I've covered Russia for over 30 years, covered Russia for the whole time that Putin has been first prime minister and then president. You know, the fundamental question, and why I thought the invasion would happen in 2022, and in fact, long before that, I was arguing there'd be a full-scale war between Russia and Ukraine as far back as 2015, is because, in my mind, for Putin, Ukraine is existential, right? For him, there is no Russia without Ukraine. You know, he wrote, you know, I mean, he said at the time, you know, the collapse of the Soviet Union, biggest catastrophe in the 20th century. I mean, Foreign Minister Lavrov appears in Alaska in a CCCP USSR sweatshirt, right? I mean, clear message that their agenda is, you know, correcting what they view as the mistakes of the past and about increasing Russia's borders. And so, you know, understanding this war and then about the solutions has to be understanding why Putin went in. Putin went in because he doesn't accept the very independence of Ukraine, its sovereignty, its independence. That's what it's about, right? It's not about Crimea. It's not about a land corridor to Crimea. It's not about the 4 regions or 5 regions if you include Crimea,
Or
right?
the extension of NATO.
It's never been about NATO enlargement.
Expansion,
It's you know, and I can go into a lot of depth why it isn't, but so, you know, how do you compromise on something so fundamental when for Putin it's about the very existence of Ukraine, and obviously the Ukrainians, they're fighting for their survival of the state. So from Trump's perspective, you know, you just listen to Putin, ask Putin what he wants, and obviously Putin will say, yes, I want Crimea, I want the 4 other regions, and give a list, but you know, that's just because you know, they're kind of, that's base camp, right? He asks for things that he knows ultimately are not deliverable for Ukraine and will destabilize the country, to help him further intervene to get what he wants, which is the total control of Ukraine, right? And I just don't think, you know, the Trump administration of Witkoff, they really get Russia and get you and the story in Ukraine, right? Witkoff is not a Russia-Ukraine specialist. He's supposed to be a Middle East peace specialist or expert. I mean, you know, the challenges in the Middle East still seem very significant, and you know, the Gaza ceasefire didn't seem to survive very long. But I think you need to really, and Putin is a serious negotiator, serious player, serious negotiator. You know, who have every day wake up and think about these issues, right? So how can you suddenly jettison a person like Steve Witkoff to Moscow, who has no real understanding of the drivers in this conflict?
He's a middling real estate broker from Manhattan.
Sure.
That's all he
Yeah.
knows. He's not an expert in the Middle East or anything else. The east side of Manhattan, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, look, I get that, you know, Trump says that he wants a peace and wants to conserve lives, and you know, take him at face value. You know, that may well be the case. And so I think he does want a win from a peace, and obviously a Nobel Prize has been mentioned, etc. But you know, I don't think. I mean, certainly Ukraine is not interested in any peace. I mean, peace has to be sustainable and durable, and it has to ensure the long-term security of Ukraine, right? So the Ukrainians are not going to accept anything. And I think maybe the way Trump views it is, you know, often to look at who are the players, what's the dynamics. There's a strong guy, there's a weak guy. Just buy off the strong guy, right? Maybe he learned this in his New York kind of real estate period. And he's identified the Ukrainians as the weak people, the Russians as the strong guy. So give the strong guy everything he wants, he'll go away. That's not the reality. Putin will not go away if you give him Crimea and the 4 regions. He will come back for more, because Putin only respects power, right? And if he sees weakness, he will exploit that and take advantage of that. So that's the way you address Putin. It's interesting. I think we've all learned a lot from the 3.5 years of this war, and longer in terms of this conflict. You know, as I said, I expected the invasion to happen in 2022. I also expected, like many in the intelligence community, and also I think many Ukrainians, they expected it to be over very quickly. I didn't imagine the Ukrainians would fight to be able to survive for 3.5 years against a far superior military power. The fact that they have is, testimony to their bravery and ingenuity, and the fact that certainly the West has given them significant support, albeit too late. But actually, and I thought, and my fear for Ukraine at that point in time, and why I thought the war would be over in 2 weeks, is that I thought that Putin always cared about Ukraine more than us. He had escalation dominance. He was willing to do anything to secure the whole of Ukraine, right? And I didn't think we were willing to confront Russia about that. Actually, what I've learned in this last 3.5 years is actually there are limits for Putin. If you think back, the Russians set lots of red lines around arms supplies to Ukraine. So if you go way back to the first few weeks after the full-scale invasion, remember the Russians said you're not allowed to supply MiG-29s, T-72s, Leopards, F-16s, ATACMS, you name it. You could go through the full spectrum of Western kit, and they threatened to bomb NATO supply routes for that kit, right? And remember also, if you go back that initial summer, there was talk about the use of tactical nuclear weapons by Russia against Ukraine. None of that happened, right? None of it happened, I think, because ultimately Putin is scared of a conventional war with NATO in Europe, because he knows the Russian military will lose that conventional war very quickly. And because in Ukraine, the Ukrainians have proven that using third generation NATO kit, they've been able to beat fourth generation Russian kit. So the war has proven Western military technological superiority over Russia, right? And Putin is scared of that, right? So in putting all that together, Putin has proven, it's been proven that Putin does have limits, right? He respects power, strength. I mean, if you go back to the use of weapons mass destruction, the use of tactical nuclear weapons, I should say, in that first summer after the full-scale invasion, I mean, what has been suggested is the Biden administration and NATO allies made it crystal clear to Putin the consequences of using tactical battlefield nuclear weapons in Ukraine, and they suggested there would be a conventional military strike against Russian assets that launched those weapons. So he would face a potential threat of a conventional war against NATO. I think the Chinese also read the riot act to Putin at that period of time. So look, bottom line is there are limits. Putin respects strength. We need to show that strength to make Putin back off in Ukraine.
Tim, last question for today. The Russian economy. How, again, I've told you this at the start of this interview. I keep reading articles about how it's been on its last leg now for the last 3.5 years. How close, if at all, is the West to altering this war, altering or changing anything about Putin's opinion about the war in Ukraine solely by sanctions? How strong or weak is the Russian economy? Where are we at right now? Is it about to collapse, or is that wishful thinking?
Well, as I mentioned, I mean, look, if we gave the Ukrainians a full 300 billion of immobilized Russian assets, I think that would send a strong signal to Putin that the Ukrainians are well financed and would be well armed for a very long war. That would make him think twice. And the state of the Russian economy, it's not doing very well. I mean, growth is 1 to 2 percentage points. Inflation is twice the central bank target. Central bank policy rates, because of high inflation, are relatively high. Industrial production is falling now. The various PMIs, confidence indicators, are going lower. There's concerns about durability in the banking system. Recent Ukrainian strikes on Russian refinery capacity are now causing real disruptions and problems in terms of supply of gas at the pumps. There are vulnerabilities, right? There are clear vulnerabilities. There are weaknesses. It's not yet on the point of collapse, but we can make life a lot more difficult by being clever in terms of what we do in terms of sanctions. The oil price cap should be reduced very significantly, from $60 to 45. We saw that did impact initially at 65. We can do a lot more in terms of, it's interesting the focus on the increase in tariffs on India recently from 25 to 50, because India has been making money out of trading Russian oil. Absolutely, they have been profiteering from the war. It's clear that India has been doing that. But actually, I would argue that again, one of the problems with sanctions, again, you want to hurt Russia, but you don't want to hurt the global economy that much. In the US Congress, there has been a sanctions bill, Lindsey Graham, etc., 500% tariff on Russian exports, commodity exports. That's not really very realistic. Let's be honest about it. I mean, a 500% tariff on countries importing Russian energy and commodities would stop Russian exports overnight, right? That would definitely crash the Russian economy. The current account surplus, the trade surplus will go into deficit. You'd see huge capital flight. The banks would collapse. Absolutely. But it would also probably cause a global financial crisis as well. Do we want that? No. Is there a cleverer way to do it? I would argue that a levy of maybe 10 to 20% on Russian oil and commodity exports to be used to fund Ukraine could actually do the job. It would help in terms of funding Ukraine. Russia exports about 300 billion a year. A 10% tariff, 30 billion, 20%, 60 billion. It would reduce the revenues flowing to the Russian budget to wage the war. It would be a confidence shock to Russia, but I think it's doable, right? A 10 to 20% levy is achievable, right? It's possible to imagine that without it being too disruptive in terms of global markets, right? So, we need to do things that are cleverer, can be effective. We need to think outside the box. We should have the wherewithal. If you think of Western economies, we're something like around $45 trillion. If you look at the US plus Europe combined, 45 trillion and other Western allies. Russia is a $2 trillion economy. We are 20 times bigger. We should have the financial muscle to really rein in Russia's economy and reduce its war efforts, both in Ukraine, but also in terms of the long-term threat from Russia to us in the future. We just don't use our leverage clever enough.
I couldn't agree with you more. Look, between Europe and the United States, we have the economic leverage to strangle the Russian economy and bring them to their knees. We also obviously have enough military might with the weapons and ammunition to allow Ukraine to militarily defeat Russia in a conventional war. But it all comes down to leadership, or in this case, the lack thereof. Tim Ash, economist, expert on the Russian economy and sanctions, geopolitical analyst. I am grateful, and I thank you for coming on the No Delusion Zone. I guess let's do this again, and you take care.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
You bet.